In the middle of downtown Chicago, the city's richest stood stranded beside a broken luxury car while strangers laughed, until a single dad stopped and changed everything without knowing her identity. Welcome to Poor Girl's Destiny, a place where quiet lives meet unexpected miracles. Wishing you a joyful day filled with hope, kindness, and inspiration. Now let's step into today's story together. At the edge of Riverfront Avenue in downtown Chicago, Evelyn Hart stood beside a stalled black electric sedan, its dashboard flickering as impatient traffic flowed around her like a river of noise and judgment. She wore a simple coat, her hair pulled back, deliberately unrecognizable, a disguise she had chosen to understand the world outside boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered to the small crowd forming nearby. A few people whispered, a few recorded on their phones, and a few laughed under their breath, assuming she was just another careless driver with expensive taste and no skill. Evelyn kept her posture calm, but inside she felt the weight of unfamiliar helplessness pressing against her pride. Across the street, Daniel Carter had just finished a long morning of work at a nearby auto shop, his hands still marked with grease, his mind focused on picking up his daughter Lily from school in less than an hour. He noticed the scene without intention, just another moment in a city full of broken things waiting for repair. But something about the woman standing alone felt different. Not her clothes, not her car, but the quiet tension in her stance, like someone refusing to ask for help even when everything was clearly failing. Lily's words echoed in his mind from that morning, that simple belief that kindness mattered more than convenience. Without overthinking, Daniel crossed the street, ignoring the murmurs around him, and approached the stalled vehicle. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask what went wrong, only gestured gently toward the hood and said he could take a look. Evelyn hesitated, studying him with cautious eyes, noticing his worn jacket and steady hands, the kind of man who had learned patience through necessity rather than choice. Around them, the crowd shifted, some amused, some skeptical, as if watching a man step into a situation above his station. Daniel simply knelt beside the car, listening to the faint electrical hum, treating it not as a luxury machine, but as something human in its own failure. Evelyn watched closely, surprised not by his skill but by his lack of hesitation, as if status meant nothing in the face of something broken. She offered to pay, almost instinctively, but Daniel shook his head without looking up, saying it was not about money. That simple refusal unsettled her more than the car's failure. In a world where every interaction had a price, his kindness felt almost foreign, even suspicious. Yet he continued working, calm and precise, as if the entire crowd had faded away. Lily, sitting on a nearby curb waiting for her father's call, would later describe moments like this as Dad fixing the world one small thing at a time. Evelyn, unaware of who stood beside her, felt something shift quietly inside her, something she could not yet name, as the city around them kept moving, indifferent to the small moment of connection forming between two strangers whose lives were about to intersect far beyond a broken car. Daniel Carter returned to his small auto shop a few blocks away, the familiar scent of oil, rubber, and warm metal greeting him like an old friend as he pushed open the garage door, the midday sun cutting through dust in the air while he checked the clock and quietly calculated how much time he had left before picking up his daughter Lily from school. He moved with steady routine, wiping his hands on a clean rag, checking a half-finished engine rebuild on a pickup truck that had been sitting in the bay for 2 days, and making a mental note of parts he still needed but could not afford until next week. Life had trained him to think in small steps, not big dreams. Yet even in exhaustion there was a rhythm to his days that kept him grounded. Across the city street, Evelyn Hart sat back in her stalled car, watching him through slightly tinted glass as he finished tightening a panel and calmly closed his toolbox as if nothing unusual had happened. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her thoughts, curiosity without calculation. She had spent years surrounded by advisors, executives, and people who spoke in numbers and projections, yet this man operated in a different language entirely, one built on action rather than explanation. She remained in her simple disguise, no luxury identifiers visible, her phone switched to silent, her presence intentionally erased from public recognition as part of a private experiment she had designed to understand how people treated others without influence or fear of consequence. Daniel did not look at her again after fixing the initial issue with her vehicle. Yet something about her presence stayed in his mind, not because of who she might be, but because of how silently she carried her uncertainty. When Lily called him shortly after noon, her small voice bright and full of excitement about a school art project, Daniel smiled more freely than he had all morning, promising her they would stop for ice cream later if time allowed. And that simple promise anchored him back into the life he valued most. Evelyn, meanwhile, observed the way he spoke on the phone, noticing how his entire expression softened when he mentioned his child, and she found herself questioning assumptions she had long accepted about strength, success, and importance. A passing group of pedestrians slowed briefly near her car, glancing at her situation with mild amusement before continuing on, assuming she was just another inconvenienced driver, and she accepted their misinterpretation without correction, because revealing her identity would defeat the purpose of why she was there. Daniel eventually walked back across the street, not to seek attention, but to ensure the repair held, and when he confirmed everything was stable, he gave a small nod as if closing a simple task rather than an encounter that had already begun shifting something unspoken between them. Evelyn asked his name this time, and he replied without hesitation, Daniel Carter, as if it carried no weight beyond introduction, and she repeated it quietly in her mind, as if trying to understand why it felt strangely different from the names she usually heard in her world. Before leaving, Daniel reminded her gently to avoid pushing the system too hard for a while and suggested a nearby service station if the issue returned, not as advice from superiority, but from practical care. Evelyn watched him walk away again, blending into the flow of the city with ease, and for the first time in years she realized she was not analyzing a problem or a business outcome, but a person whose simplicity unsettled her understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The afternoon traffic in downtown Chicago had begun to thicken, horns echoing between glass buildings as sunlight shifted lower across the skyline, casting long reflections on wet pavement from a brief morning drizzle that had already faded into humidity. Evelyn Hart remained seated in her vehicle longer than necessary after Daniel Carter walked away, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel even though the car had already been repaired and was functioning perfectly again. There was no logical reason to stay, no meeting scheduled, no obligation holding her in place. Yet she found herself studying the street where he had disappeared into the crowd, as if trying to locate something she had not realized she was searching for. In her world, every interaction had measurable outcomes, yet this one left no clear category, only a lingering sense of imbalance she could not explain. She finally started the car and drove slowly through the avenue, but instead of heading directly back to her office tower, she found herself circling the same few blocks, as though repetition might provide clarity. Meanwhile, Daniel had already arrived at the front gate of Lily Carter's elementary school, leaning casually against his old pickup truck as children poured out in waves of laughter and backpacks, each moment pulling him further away from the encounter that had just passed through his day. Lily spotted him instantly, running with small, determined steps before jumping into his arms, her voice bright as she described a classroom drawing contest where she had painted a picture of their home under a sky full of stars. Daniel smiled, listening fully, giving her the kind of attention that made the rest of the world feel distant, and for a while the memory of the woman with the broken car faded behind the warmth of his daughter's excitement. Across the city, Evelyn finally parked near her corporate headquarters, a towering structure of steel and glass that reflected the skyline like a mirror of control and precision. Yet as she stepped out of the vehicle, she hesitated for a brief moment, something in her expression uncharacteristically distracted. Her assistant approached immediately with a tablet full of scheduled meetings and financial updates, but Evelyn only nodded absent-mindedly, her mind still replaying the simplicity of Daniel Carter's actions, the absence of expectation in his voice, and the strange calm he carried even when surrounded by judgmental eyes. Inside the building, executives greeted her with respect and careful formality, yet she responded with shorter phrases than usual, her focus divided between corporate obligations and an unfamiliar curiosity she had no intention of revealing. Later that evening, while reviewing company reports in her private office overlooking the city lights, She paused at random intervals, her gaze drifting toward the window where distant streets continued their endless movement, and she found herself thinking not about market expansion or quarterly performance, but about a man who had fixed a problem without asking who she was. Daniel, on the other hand, was helping Lily finish her homework at their small kitchen table, the sound of pencil on paper mixing with the quiet hum of a refrigerator that had been repaired twice in the last year, each small imperfection reminding him of the life he had built through persistence rather than privilege. Lily asked him why some people were unkind to strangers, and Daniel paused before answering, choosing words that were simple enough for her to understand, yet deep enough to reflect what he believed, saying that kindness required no audience and no reward. In a high-rise office across the city, Evelyn Hart closed her laptop without finishing her final report, something she had never done before, and leaned back in silence as she considered whether the world she had mastered so completely might still contain things she had never truly seen. The next morning in downtown Chicago arrived with a pale gray light filtering through the glass towers of Hart Tech Industries, where Evelyn Hart stood inside a high-level conference room listening to executives discuss acquisition strategies and global expansion plans, yet her attention drifted in quiet intervals that no one around her seemed to notice. The room was filled with polished voices and carefully structured confidence, but Evelyn found herself unusually detached, as if part of her mind remained somewhere else entirely, still replaying the simplicity of a stranger kneeling beside a broken car, without expectation or hesitation. After the meeting ended, she walked with her assistant through a corridor lined with digital displays showing the company's achievements, each one a reminder of her influence over markets and industries, yet none of it seemed to hold the same clarity it once did. Her assistant, Natalie Brooks, mentioned an upcoming charity event attended by influential business leaders, including private investors and media figures, but Evelyn only responded with short acknowledgments, her thoughts divided in ways she could not yet articulate. At the same time, Daniel Carter was in a very different part of the city, standing inside his small auto repair shop as the morning rush of work began to build, the sound of tools and engines creating a rhythm that grounded him more than any corporate silence ever could. A customer complained about a delayed repair, another asked for a price reduction, and Daniel handled each situation with calm patience, his focus never drifting from the practical reality of keeping his life stable for Lily. During a short break, he checked his phone and saw a message from Lily's school reminding parents about an upcoming family day event, and he smiled briefly at the thought of spending an afternoon away from work with her, even if only for a few hours. Meanwhile, inside a luxury cafe across town, Evelyn met with two of her longtime acquaintances, both executives in her social circle who were accustomed to discussing wealth, investments, and status as casually as others discussed weather. One of them, Richard Hale, made a passing comment about the recent news of CEOs stepping out into the public under disguise, laughing slightly as he described it as unnecessary experimentation with ordinary life, while the other, Vanessa Cole, added that people in power rarely learn anything meaningful from such experiences. Evelyn listened without reacting, her expression controlled, but inside she felt an unexpected discomfort rising, not from their words alone, but from how easily they dismissed the lives of people outside their world. She excused herself early, citing a scheduling conflict, and walked alone for a few blocks before stopping near a busy intersection, watching pedestrians move with purpose and struggle in equal measure. At that same moment, Daniel finished a repair on an old sedan, handing back the keys to a grateful customer who offered him a tip that he politely declined, repeating his usual explanation that fair work did not require extra payment beyond agreement. As the day continued, Evelyn found herself canceling two non-essential appointments without explanation, a decision that surprised even her assistant, while Daniel picked up Lily from school and listened to her talk about a classmate who had shared lunch with her without being asked. In two completely different worlds separated by wealth and distance, both Evelyn Hart and Daniel Carter moved through their day, carrying quiet thoughts that were slowly beginning to shift the way they saw the people around them, though neither of them yet understood how deeply those small moments would soon begin to connect their lives. That evening in downtown Chicago, the city lights reflected off the glass surface of Hart Tech Industries like scattered fragments of a world that never slowed down. While inside her private office at the top floor, Evelyn Hart stood alone for the first time that day, no longer surrounded by executives or structured conversations, only the quiet hum of electronics and the distant movement of traffic far below. She had removed her formal blazer, loosening the controlled image she always carried, yet her mind remained unusually active, returning again and again to the same unfamiliar thought she had been unable to dismiss since the afternoon incident. A man who fixed her problem without asking for anything in return. A man who treated her like any other person. Across the city, Daniel Carter was finishing closing procedures at his auto shop, wiping down his hands as he checked the final lock on the garage doors, while Lily sat inside the truck drawing in her notebook under the soft glow of the dashboard light. She showed him a sketch of two stick figures standing under a large tree, explaining that it was her and him on a day when nothing was broken and no one was in a hurry, and Daniel smiled quietly, not fully realizing how deeply those simple moments defined everything he lived for. At the same time, Evelyn stood near her office window, holding a cup of untouched coffee, listening as her assistant Natalie Brooks spoke through a tablet update about upcoming investor briefings. But Evelyn's attention drifted toward a decision she could not explain even to herself, instructing Natalie to clear her schedule for the following afternoon without providing a reason. The request caused a brief pause on the other end of the line, because Evelyn Hart did not cancel meetings lightly, yet she repeated the instruction with calm certainty before ending the call and returning to silence. She then opened a secure file on her personal device, reviewing anonymous reports about public infrastructure failures and roadside incidents across the city, though none of it directly required her involvement, as if searching for something she could not name. Meanwhile, Daniel was at home helping Lily prepare a small dinner, the kitchen filled with simple sounds of cooking and conversation, while he reminded her to finish her homework before bedtime, and she responded with the kind of easy trust that made even ordinary evenings feel meaningful. As nights settled over Chicago, Evelyn left her office building without her usual escort vehicle, choosing instead to walk a few blocks alone through the quieter streets, her heels echoing softly against the pavement as she passed storefronts and small groups of people living entirely different versions of the same city. She stopped briefly near a bus stop where a maintenance worker was repairing a broken streetlight, watching him work for a moment before continuing forward, her thoughts once again returning to the memory of Daniel Carter's steady presence and refusal to accept payment. In another part of the city, Daniel sat on his porch steps after putting Lily to bed, looking out at the dim glow of passing cars while thinking about how small acts of help often cost nothing but meant everything to the people receiving them. Neither Evelyn nor Daniel knew it yet, but the quiet paths they were walking were beginning to shift toward the same direction, guided not by wealth or circumstance, but by the growing weight of choices made without expectation and the unseen connections forming between two lives that had never been meant to intersect, yet were now slowly moving toward the same inevitable moment. The following morning arrived in Chicago with a soft golden haze spreading across the skyline, as if the city itself was hesitating between clarity and uncertainty. While inside Hart Tech Industries, Evelyn Hart stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window on the 43rd floor, holding a tablet that displayed early market updates she was no longer fully focused on. Her assistant Natalie Brooks stood nearby reviewing a schedule packed with meetings, yet Evelyn interrupted her mid-sentence and requested a single adjustment, clearing a 2-hour window in the afternoon without providing explanation, something that made Natalie pause slightly longer than usual before acknowledging the change. Evelyn then turned away from the window, walking slowly through her office space lined with glass walls and quiet digital displays, her mind still returning to the same unresolved thought that had followed her since the encounter with the mechanic in the city street. At the same time, Daniel Carter was already at work inside his small auto repair shop on the west side of Chicago, where the sound of tools and engines created a steady rhythm that felt more honest to him than any corporate silence he had ever imagined. He greeted customers with polite familiarity, explaining repairs in simple terms, and never once thinking that his morning routine would intersect with anything outside his ordinary responsibilities. Lily Carter was at school, and Daniel had promised to pick her up early for a small afternoon outing, a promise he intended to keep no matter how busy the day became. Across the city, Evelyn finally left the Heart Tech building around midday, choosing to travel without a driver, something she rarely did. And as she moved through the busy streets, she instructed her assistant remotely to forward only urgent communications. Her destination was not officially listed in her calendar, yet she found herself guiding the car toward the same district where she had met Daniel Carter, though she did not fully understand why she was returning. When she arrived near the intersection of Riverfront Avenue, she parked a short distance away and stepped out into the open air, scanning the surroundings, as if expecting something familiar to appear again. Daniel, meanwhile, had just arrived at Lily's school and was standing near the pickup area, watching children leave in groups while checking the time on his phone, unaware that the woman from the previous day was now only a few blocks away. Evelyn walked slowly along the sidewalk, observing small businesses, street vendors, and ordinary conversations between strangers, noticing details she had previously ignored in her structured life. And for the first time, she felt the absence of any controlled environment around her. She stopped near a small cafe and hesitated before entering. Sitting alone by the window where she could observe the street, her thoughts still circling around the calm confidence of Daniel Carter's actions. Daniel and Lily left the school together a few minutes later, walking toward their truck while discussing her school assignment. And Lily laughed softly at something her father said about drawing what makes people feel safe rather than what looks perfect. Evelyn watched the street from inside the cafe, without realizing that the man she was thinking about was moving through the same area only a short distance away. As Daniel drove away with Lily beside him, Evelyn remained seated, her coffee untouched, slowly beginning to recognize that her return to this part of the city was not coincidental, but part of something she could no longer dismiss as simple curiosity, even though she did not yet understand what it was leading toward. Inside the glass tower of Hart Tech Industries, the afternoon light stretched across polished floors as Evelyn Hart stood before a large conference table filled with executives who were discussing quarterly projections. Yet her attention drifted in a way that had become increasingly difficult to control since her encounter with Daniel Carter. Numbers were spoken, charts were displayed, and decisions were made with precision. But Evelyn found herself replaying small fragments of memory that carried no financial value, yet weighed heavily on her focus. After the meeting ended, she remained seated longer than necessary while others exited the room, her fingers resting lightly on a document she had already reviewed twice without absorbing its meaning. Across the city, Daniel Carter was closing up his auto shop earlier than usual, honoring his promise to Lily for an afternoon together at a small riverside park where they often went to draw and talk about school projects. Lily sat in the passenger seat of his old truck, humming softly while holding a sketchbook against her lap, completely unaware that her father's ordinary day was becoming part of a pattern he had not yet recognized. As they drove through traffic, Daniel noticed a slight change in the rhythm of the city, as if certain intersections felt heavier with movement than usual, though he dismissed the thought as simple fatigue from long work hours. Meanwhile, Evelyn left the Hart Tech building without her usual escort, choosing instead to walk several blocks alone before reaching her car, a decision that surprised even her assistant who offered to accompany her but was gently dismissed. She drove again toward the downtown district where she had seen Daniel before, this time with a clearer sense of intention she could not fully explain, parking a short distance from the same cafe she had visited earlier. Inside, she sat near the window once more, observing the street with quiet focus, noticing how people moved with purpose, how strangers shared space without acknowledgement, and how life continued without regard for status or control. At the Riverside Park, Daniel sat with Lily on a wooden bench while she sketched the skyline reflected in the water, and he pointed out small details in the scenery that most people would overlook, encouraging her to draw what she felt rather than what she saw. Lily laughed softly when a passing dog interrupted her drawing, and Daniel smiled in a way that made the moment feel stable, as if nothing in the world required urgency. Back in the cafe, Evelyn observed a group of customers interacting with the barista, noticing how small acts of courtesy created an atmosphere that felt unfamiliar yet strangely grounding, and she found herself thinking again about Daniel Carter, wondering why his presence lingered in her thoughts longer than any business conversation she had ever had. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Lily left the park as the light began to shift toward evening. And while driving home, he noticed a brief traffic delay near the downtown district, unaware that only a few blocks away Evelyn was still seated by the window watching the same streets from a different perspective. For the first time, Evelyn did not leave immediately after finishing her drink, remaining longer than planned as if waiting for something she could not define, while Daniel returned home to prepare dinner with Lily, both of them moving through their routine unaware that the quiet distance between their worlds was beginning to shorten in ways neither of them could yet see. The next morning in downtown Chicago began with an unusual sense of anticipation inside the financial district, where news vans had quietly gathered near Hart Tech Industries, their presence subtle at first, but growing as reporters confirmed that Evelyn Hart would be making a rare public appearance outside of scheduled investor events. Inside the building, assistants moved with careful urgency, adjusting seating arrangements and preparing statements about a new corporate initiative focused on community mobility support, a program designed to connect technology with everyday citizens in need. Evelyn stood in a private preparation room overlooking the city, dressed in a simple tailored outfit that balanced authority with approachability, yet her expression remained distant for reasons even she could not fully explain. Across the city, Daniel Carter was at his auto shop beginning a routine morning repair schedule, unaware that the events unfolding several miles away were already circling toward a moment that would directly involve him. Lily was at school, and Daniel had planned to pick her up early again, maintaining the small rhythm of life that anchored him through long working days. At Hart Tech, the press briefing began with calm introductions, Evelyn stepping forward as cameras flashed, her presence immediately commanding attention as she spoke about expanding access to technical assistance programs for underserved communities. Reporters listened closely, asking structured questions about funding and implementation, while Evelyn responded with measured clarity, maintaining her usual composed control. However, midway through the event, one of the journalists unexpectedly referenced a recently circulated video showing a roadside repair interaction involving an unidentified mechanic assisting a woman with a stalled vehicle in downtown Chicago. The video had gained quiet attention online, initially unnoticed, but had begun circulating through local networks due to the unusual circumstances of the interaction. As the footage played on a screen behind the reporters, Evelyn's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, recognizing the scene before the narrator even identified its location. The video showed Daniel Carter calmly repairing her vehicle without hesitation, while the woman in the clip remained unnamed, her identity still unknown to the public. A reporter asked whether Hart Tech had any connection to the incident, and for the first time during the briefing, Evelyn paused longer than usual before responding, choosing her words carefully as she acknowledged that she had been present but had not expected the moment to become public. Meanwhile, across the city at his auto shop, Daniel had just finished replacing a brake assembly on a customer vehicle when Lily called him from school to tell him that some students had mentioned seeing a video of a man helping someone downtown, though she did not fully understand its significance. Daniel brushed it off calmly, assuming it was just another social media clip unrelated to him, focusing instead on closing out the repair ticket. Back at Hart Tech, the briefing concluded earlier than planned, but the story had already begun spreading beyond control, as clips of the roadside interaction were shared across local news platforms, slowly connecting details that led observers to speculate about the identity of the woman in the video. Within hours, online discussions began identifying her as Evelyn Hart, based on vehicle data, location records, and subtle visual confirmations, turning what had been an unnoticed encounter into a rapidly spreading public revelation. By late afternoon, Daniel Carter received a message from a former coworker asking if he had seen the news, followed by a link that he opened without expectation, only to see his own actions displayed on a screen alongside the confirmation of the woman's identity as one of the most influential executives in the city. He sat quietly for a moment in his small office chair, the noise of the garage fading into the background as Lily's earlier words about kindness returned to his thoughts in a way that now felt unexpectedly significant. At the same time, Evelyn stood alone in her office again, watching the city below while news notifications continued to rise, realizing that the quiet encounter she had treated as a personal observation had now become a public narrative connecting her world directly to Daniel Carter's in a way neither of them had anticipated. marking the first irreversible turning point in a story that was no longer private but unfolding in full view of an entire city. The news cycle in Chicago shifted rapidly as the afternoon light faded into a colder tone, with digital screens across the city replaying fragments of the roadside encounter between Evelyn Hart and Daniel Carter, turning what had once been an unnoticed moment into a topic of public discussion that neither of them had prepared for. Inside Hart Tech Industries, Evelyn stood in her office, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than usual, her phone displaying repeated notifications from media outlets requesting confirmation, statements, and exclusive commentary, yet she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked out over the city skyline, watching the movement of traffic below, as if trying to locate a point where everything had started to change. Across town, Daniel Carter sat in his small auto shop after closing hours, the glow of a single overhead light reflecting off the tools he had just cleaned, while Lily read quietly in the waiting chair, unaware of the significance of what was unfolding beyond their ordinary evening. Daniel had seen the news earlier, the video clip, and the confirmation of Evelyn Hart's identity, yet he had not reacted with shock or excitement. Only a quiet pause as he considered how a simple act of help had now become something larger than intention. Lily looked up at him occasionally, sensing a change in his silence, but Daniel simply told her that people sometimes notice things later than they should, then returned to preparing their usual drive home. Meanwhile, Evelyn finally agreed to a controlled statement prepared by her communications team, stepping briefly into a secured press room where only a limited number of reporters were allowed. She spoke calmly about the importance of recognizing everyday acts of kindness, carefully avoiding personal detail while acknowledging the incident as part of a broader reflection on human connection beyond corporate identity. However, even as she spoke, her thoughts were not on the carefully structured message in front of her, but on the man who had repaired her vehicle without hesitation, without recognition, and without expectation. After the briefing ended, she remained behind as the room cleared, her assistant Natalie Brooks waiting quietly nearby, observing the rare hesitation in her employer's behavior. Evelyn instructed Natalie to gather more information about Daniel Carter, not for publicity purposes, but with a level of personal interest that she did not attempt to fully explain. At the same time, Daniel arrived home with Lily, the evening routine continuing with familiar simplicity, yet the atmosphere around him felt subtly different, as if unseen attention had begun to move in his direction. He received another message from a local number confirming that someone had been asking about him through indirect channels, but he did not respond, choosing instead to focus on preparing dinner and helping Lily with her school project. In a high-rise office above the city, Evelyn reviewed a brief compiled profile of Daniel Carter, reading fragments of his life that described a hard-working single father, a mechanic known for refusing unnecessary payment, and a man who lived without public recognition or ambition for attention. Each line of information deepened her sense of curiosity rather than resolving it, because nothing in his background explained why his presence had left such a lasting impression on her. As night settled over Chicago once again, both Evelyn Hart and Daniel Carter found themselves in separate spaces under the same sky, each aware in their own way that something irreversible had begun, not through planned connection or calculated decision, but through a single moment of unplanned honesty that the world had now chosen to notice. Thank you for watching until the end of this story. We truly appreciate your time and support. Please share your thoughts and feelings about this video in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Poor Girl's Destiny for more emotional and inspiring stories every day. See you in the next video.